In the second chapter of the famous Feynman lectures, Dr. Feynman starts by describing a scene with a person on the beach. He mentions the sea and the sloshing waves, the clouds, sun, and blue sky. There are animals and seaweed, hunger and disease, and an observer taking it all in. He then goes on to ask a series of ontological questions about the scene, such as, is the sand perhaps nothing but a great number of very tiny stones? Is the moon a great rock? If we understand rocks, would we understand the sand and the moon? And so on. Feynman then introduces the scientific method as a way to find partial answers to such questions, emphasizing that the scene at the beach is too complex for us to describe even with our modern physics. What we call understanding is the knowledge of the fundamental rules of how the physical world plays out. But even if we knew every rule, we might never be able to understand why. Here, one of the greatest minds of the 20th century is explicitly teaching us how provisional the empirical capacities of science ultimately are. We might be able to discover the rules of reality and be able to engineer and build magnificent things, but this doesn't explain why, or even certain questions of how. Explanatory theories that answer why questions might never be found through deductive reasoning or experimental means. In his Nobel Prize speech in 1965, Feynman famously said, "A very great deal more truth can be known than can be proven." But how does this truth come to be known? It must involve more than just scientific experiment and measure. And whatever the limits of physics are, problems that plague the social sciences and psychology are worse. It has always struck me as remarkably naive to believe that something as complex and immaterial as emotions and inner experience could be reduced to mechanism and be captured in any meaningful way with a set of 4 or 5 variables. Variables that by necessity are material enough for us to control. Never mind the effects of a lab setting on participants, and the varying degrees of self-awareness and idiosyncrasies of each person, and the qualitative nature of most measurements. Nothing so much annoys me as a social scientist who utters the phrase, "I'm a data guy." At best, this person is confessing they are less a scientist and more a technician. At worst, this person lacks key awareness of their own implicit assumptions. A steward of scientism, priding themselves on the illusion of objectivity. Arthur Brooks, a prominent academic, stated in an interview that if you read the findings of a new study to your grandmother and she says, "No, that's not right," chances are that your grandmother is probably right and the study's conclusion is wrong. In our modern age, the psychology PhD selling their data-driven self-help book is the modern-day snake oil salesman. Science bent towards the dollar. But how does truth come to be known? Deductive analysis can only unpack its initial premise, yet we are scarcely aware that we often have to define the truths we can find before we even start to measure. Nietzsche said, "Every concept is an equation of unequals." In other words, every category requires we ignore the uniqueness inherent in individuals and reality. We shear off any minor detail of difference in the name of analysis, categories, and manipulation. Every concept we have is an approximation. All the while, reality lives and breathes and is animate. Feynman was careful to say the scientific method gives partial answers. More so than ever, we ought to keep this in mind.